Ross. Yep.
Thanks, Daphne. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Senate Education. It is Thursday, January 6th at 3 p.m. It was brought to our attention. First of all, welcome, Ms. Livingston, Mr. Fisher. Great to have both of you. And I do apologize. Committee members don't know, behind the scenes, both of these folks, given their incredibly pressing schedules, and in the case of, I think, Ms. Livingston, relatively still new to her position, have incredible demands on them. So I greatly and sincerely appreciate the two of you making the time to be with us today. And really what we're trying to, and I also want to acknowledge that I know things are changing fast, and the two of you certainly aren't expected to have all the answers, but I'm hoping that you might help us to navigate through some of the questions that are coming up that we're hearing from our constituents, from leadership, from others, things that have been a little bit in the press. And even if you can't answer, we completely understand. We'll just all kind of start to come up with a list of questions and curate that list and get them to Dr. Levine, Dr. French, or whatever individual in your agencies can best answer them. I thought, if it's okay, we'll just start by having a conversation with the two of you around how communication is generally happening between the agency and the Department of Health and the schools as it relates to COVID and the pandemic, as things are sort of coming in, as the agency, Department of Health, is learning things, or even as the Agency of Education is learning things. Maybe the two of you could just talk a little bit about that, and that could be a good starting point. And also, if you want to, if you don't want to talk about that, even though I think you both are comfortable doing so, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, what you're hearing. We've had people in to talk to us about also how we can be helpful during this time. So with that, Ms. Livingston, it looks like you've decided to unmute yourself. So if you want to begin, that would be great.
I just wanted to say hello. So I'm Shayla Livingston. I'm the policy director for the Agency of Human Services. And as the chair alluded to, I started on Monday, so you'll forgive me for a couple of things that I'm not quite totally up to speed on, but I am here to hear your questions, make sure we know what they are, and get the right person back with the right information for you going forward. So I'm going to leave it to Ted to kick off with any comments that he has, but really what I want to do today is make sure that we know what it is that you're hearing, and we know what it is that you need from us to understand what's been happening on the ground with schools.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon. For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education, and the agency's Director of Communications and Legislative. Very excited to see you all again. I very much appreciated being with you all in a virtual mode last year, and I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to be in person in the near future if pandemic conditions allow. So I also wear the hat in the COVID context of COVID-19 response manager. So I appreciate and the other part of my title is communications director for the agency. So I'm happy, as I often see you folks in the legislative side, but I'm happy to talk about communications. I'm always happy to talk about communications. But I thought, Senator Campion, if it's your, Mr. Chair, if it's your pleasure, I can give a sort of a very brief introductory overview, and then we can sort of dive into gathering questions and seeing what we can handle today, if that works for you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, excellent. So just not to give too much of a historical backdrop, but the agency has been involved, not quite, and I should just say, I apologize, Shayla. I just want to say I'm glad to be working again with Shayla. We work together many times on legislative and policy initiatives with the agency and the Agency of Education and the Department of Health. So grateful to be working with her again. So the Agency of Education has not been working quite as long as the Health Department, Shayla and her colleagues were at the beginning of the pandemic, but we have been involved in the pandemic response from day one. And I would say up front that a large portion, a very large portion of our role has simply been to communicate with schools. And when I say communicate with schools, I mean specifically communicate with school administrators, and to the limited extent that we can communicate with educators directly. When I talk, just generally speaking, when the agency does communications with schools, we generally speaking talk to school administrations. And we target messaging at educators, but I do not have a list that I can hit every educator in the state with. I do have a list. I can email every superintendent. The Secretary French can communicate with every superintendent and does routinely in the context of COVID and otherwise. So we were involved from the very beginning in communicating out the state's messaging when we were in the emergency management construct, pre-state of emergency and then during the state of emergency. We have maintained that role post. We were, just to place things in the org chart, we were part of the State Emergency Operations Center, which was the partner of the Health Operations Center, which is still ongoing, and I think is, if not already at their 2-year anniversary mark, is approaching it. We were in the SEOC until we demobilized. We have continued to operate with our COVID-19 response team, as well as the many other agency teams, the line divisions and others that have been working on COVID-related tasks since the beginning. And so we've continued that work without interruption through that period of time. I should note that it's, as I think I said to this committee last year, it's a whole agency effort. We have a smaller team that manages specifically the communications and some of the emergency response aspects. That's the team that I lead. And generally speaking, what we do just from the top down is we send several updates a week to superintendents and independent school heads of school. We also created, when we did our guidance for last year, the title of COVID-19 coordinator, which is a single individual employed either by the district or by the independent school to coordinate COVID-19 activities for the school district or the independent school. And I'm probably just going to use the term district for just basic understanding in this conversation, but for the purposes of the actual org chart, what we're referring to is supervisory unions, or when a supervisory union is also a supervisory district, an SU. So it's the SUSD level, just to level set here. We don't necessarily communicate with individual school boards in places where we have SUs with multiple school districts. So we have one SU COVID-19 coordinator. We also send commonly many messages to them, as well as the majority of the messages that also go to superintendents. So those updates happen usually twice a week. If we have to do 3, we do 3. If we have to do 4, we do 4. We try to keep it regular and understandable. Ideally, my team likes to do Tuesdays and Thursdays so that we make sure that we have a sort of predictable cadence for folks. And those updates will include anything. They'll include new guidance memos. So if you look at the agency website and see some of our advisory memos about COVID mitigation strategies or about COVID testing, all of those things we will try to get into an update. We will occasionally send what we like to refer to as a one-off email, which is something that is really either critically urgent or it's very important and it merits an entire email. We'll send that out. So I've talked a lot about how, just very briefly here, but a lot about how we speak with administrators, specifically the CEOs, the superintendents as their role as a chief executive of a school district. We also have, through the health department, a communications pipeline with school nurses specifically. So the AOE can email COVID-19 coordinators. And I apologize, I was remiss in saying a moment ago that COVID-19 coordinators are often school nurses that have been designated by their central office leadership team as holding that role, but they are not always necessarily school nurses. So we also will provide information via the health department to school nurses to help and assist them with that. In terms of, because communication is a two-way street, in terms of feedback, I'll just note that Secretary French also meets weekly with superintendents. He does a call with them every week. He generally gives them a COVID-19 update, makes some observations about what's going on, potentially foreshadows things that might be forthcoming in terms of guidance or what the problems that we're facing. And then this is a meeting conducted in Teams, so they will put questions into the chat and he'll do his best to respond to them. And that's also a valuable source of sort of, for lack of a better term, business intelligence for us in terms of knowing what's on the minds of superintendents, and allows our team to start working on things that are coming up and prepare either future guidance or communicate with our health department colleagues or others in the state's response about issues that are upcoming with schools. We also meet, the secretary has an advisory group, and we also meet on a regular basis with school nurses. As AOE, we have health department folks who participate with us on those calls, but we meet with them with their school nurse association leadership in order to sort of hear from them what the challenges they're seeing. I think you are all very well aware of the challenges the educator workforce in general faces, as well as the challenges that the school nurse workforce faces. So we talk with them about those things, as well as about more specific things about the guidance and things like that. A lot of this fall has been focused on testing and vaccines and the logistics of that. So we have some opportunities to get organizational learning and feedback from our field partners and colleagues, and either work to improve our programs or to respond to the challenges that they're seeing on the ground. I think I might just hold there. I could talk a lot more about this, but I might just hold there and see if there are questions.
I have a few that I'll just kick things off with. So you mentioned that school nurses in general are the COVID-19 coordinators at each school. Do you have a percentage, Ted, of schools that don't have school nurses? Any idea? And then who it might usually fall to? I would defer to Shayla as to whether she has that at her fingertips. I would imagine that's something that we should come back to you with. Okay. We have had a lot of conversations about sort of like what might the future state be in terms of our relationship with school nurses. Yeah. However, right now, the sort of area of responsibility, for lack of a better term, or well, I like to sometimes jokingly refer to it as the frontier between the health department and the AOE, is that the school nurse coordinator position and the folks who work directly with school nurses are in the health department. So they might have a little bit more of the background information there. That's an extremely close relationship that we have forged throughout the pandemic. It was existing before, but it has only strengthened with the unit that does that work, as well as with the school nurse coordinator directly, to make sure that we are hearing challenges from school nurses and also communicating effectively with them about the state's response. Shayla?
I just want to clarify your question so that I get the right information. Are you just looking for the percentage, or are you concerned about schools that don't have school nurses, if their COVID coordinators have the resources they need? Like, what's the background there? Just
I mean, honestly, the way you just asked it is much better. I was just thinking in general, how many school nurses do we not have out there that, because we've been talking a lot in this committee about workforce development stuff already around mental health, certainly teacher shortages, substitute teacher. And then I would just add also to that, where are we with nurses in the classroom, in the schools. But it does, the way you asked it is even better. I mean, then who picks it up if it's not the nurse? And then the question for me, the follow-up question would be, and I hesitate to ask it, but because I recognize everybody's doing extra work right now, but our nurses who are taking on these additional responsibilities, do you know if they're being compensated in any way? To be the coordinator, COVID-19 coordinator at a school strikes me as a big job, something, again, folks are taking on and above and beyond. Is there any compensation there? Or is it district by district, or?
I think it's going to vary, certainly, in terms of being district by district. I'm not sure that we have actual data on the ground. I know of some districts where they have been able to, and frankly been lucky enough or had the resources to be able to. So, for example, say to a school nurse, this is your job for the year. This is your job. you're not doing you're not involved in other clinical responsibilities, for example. We did give out some guidance, and it is not in my brain. I apologize. So I can reach back out and follow up with it to you, Mr. Chair. But we did give some guidance about to the sort of the guardrails for schools to use their federal funds for staffing related issues like this, as to whether or not you, for example, give extra compensation to school nurses or have flexibility like that. For schools that are trying to hire an additional person, and some have, they face the same hiring challenges that we all do, and we see across the sectors, across employment sectors in Vermont and around the country.
Ms. Livingston, did you want to add anything to that? No, okay. There was just, okay, so Senator Hooker, why don't you jump in?
Thanks, thank you. And thank you both for being here. It's my understanding that schools are not allowing the public in now. When you drop your child off, the child goes into school. When you pick them up outside of the school. I just had, about a half an hour ago, a call from a mom who is concerned because she's heard that next week there's going to be a sort of a vaccine clinic run out of the elementary school in her town, and that the public is going to be allowed to go in and get vaccines. I can understand vaccinating the kids and the staff. Can you just address the idea of the public being allowed to go in?
Absolutely. So firstly, I just want to, Senator, clarify, I do not know to what extent the entire state education system is allowing public access to the buildings. Under the Strong and Healthy Start guidance of last year, which was our state guidance promulgated under the executive order, schools were not allowed to permit access from the general public, except for certain exceptions. So one was use of schools for town meeting day or voting activities in the interest of democracy. The other was for things like vaccine clinics. We purposefully scheduled and requested that schools work with us to schedule and exempted public access for scheduling, understanding that it was in the public interest for schools, which are often the premier, if not the only community facility of size that allows for a vaccine clinic. That was often why. Now, without knowing more about the specific details, I can't speak specifically, but there, when we have scheduled vaccine clinics this fall, even if and it's important when we're talking about the pediatric community, when we've scheduled vaccines for the pediatric Pfizer vaccine, so specifically targeted at school-age children, we have oftentimes still kept the clinics, I'm going to use sort of air quotes here, quote unquote, open. And that is that we have students from the school and from the district who need access to the clinic, but we also wanted to make sure that there was access for other families from a local independent school or from another school district neighboring that wasn't hosting a clinic to be able to access the vaccine there, right? So there have been some, what we, again, using air quotes, called closed clinics, where it's really truly the school operating clinic only for its population. But for the most part, these have been publicly accessible, even if they have been restricted to the population, the school age population.
Okay, so do you have a list of places that will be offering vaccines for starting next week?
Sorry,
sure, there is a list, Senator, so I'm sure we can get that for you. Is there a specific town or are you just worried about this one instance, or are you trying to gauge the sort of entirety of this question?
I just heard from one parent, and it just happened, so it was a timely call, and I thought I would ask about it. This was in Poultney, so it's in Rutland County, and it would be nice to know, and certainly good for the community to know, what's being offered at the schools.
I do just want to clarify one item, Senator, by your leave. The not all schools are necessarily closing their building. I'm not aware of where exactly that stands at this point. So there may be other schools where public access allowed for any number of other activities that aren't related to vaccine clinics. But in the context of vaccine clinics, we usually request that even if it is closed, by we, I mean the state generally speaking, but specifically it's the health department right now that is scheduling the specific clinics, request that even if the school is closed, that they open their building for the purposes of this. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily, speaking from experience, doesn't mean necessarily that they're letting folks wander freely. I had the opportunity to visit a vaccine clinic in Champlain Elementary in Burlington in November. And what they had done is they had closed their gym off on one end. So they had public access from their gym through a sort of a separate entrance. So they're having the public come into the vaccine clinic. They closed off access to the rest of the school so that their students weren't coming in and out of the gym. Not all facilities are structured that way. So you can't, some schools, their gym is sort of inside of the physical plant and you have to sort of walk through the school. And those were issues that we navigated usually on an individual basis with school districts a lot last spring. And by now we've had some practice doing school clinics. So by now these are the type of conversations that happen on the logistics side when a clinic is getting scheduled that sort of get worked out there.
Okay. And I could imagine that it's, this is what happens when the stories start to go around the community. And it would be good to know and to hear from the agencies what's being planned for the near future. Thanks.
Yeah, and what protections, again, are there? The disease can last, as I understand it, for quite a while. People walk into a building, touch something. If you're a child, is there greater exposure? Just what sorts of precautions? And then, is there a philosophy also behind having vaccination clinics at schools in that it might encourage then family members, parents, others to take advantage of entering the school and getting vaccinated at that point. Shayla?
No, and Chair, I can get you the specifics,
Great.
Senator Hooker, of which schools and which clinics are happening going forward. But I definitely want to reinforce that, school-based vaccination like this is incredibly convenient and easy access for parents and children. And so it is a very good strategy to use to ensure that kids have access to this really, what is really important right now. Yeah. So I want to emphasize that, and we can get to any other guidance that has been provided around safety for buildings.
I can just say ditto Shayla on that, but Senator Campion, what you said very eloquently at the end of your comment there was exactly one of the planning considerations for having school-based vaccine clinics.
Senator Lyons, you had your hand up. It's now down. Did you want to?
Well, I'm going to hold off for a bit, so
Okay, sure.
you can go ahead. Yeah.
Senator Persley.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to meet you, Shayla. Nice to see you again, Ted. I'll tell you a quick story what happened to me, and you can just kind of respond. On our first day, when we had Secretary French came in, talked about different things were happening in the schools and the Kits for Kids, I got the impression that it was, a successful program. But that same day, I had a conversation with a constituent that was upset about not all the parents got kits. And I said, well, it's not like there's a bunch of kits out there that they're hoarding in a warehouse somewhere and they didn't get out. It's just the kits are hard to get. Maybe they couldn't get all the kits that we needed. But then they sent me the email of the Digger article saying there was a bunch of kits stored that didn't get out. So I wonder just kind of what is the update from the Kits for Kids? Did all the ones, the whole 87 or 90,000 or whatever it was that the governor had said, did all those eventually get to families? Just what's the update on that program?
Absolutely. So firstly, and I'm so sorry to hear that it sounds like someone may have had trouble either getting access to a kit or finding a location or registering And we have heard there with any large scale, with any sort of large scale resource distribution, there are always, there can always be challenges either on an individual level or greater ones. And I just will say, sort of almost on my own behalf, what I really appreciate about being part of this response is that we are constantly working on continuous improvement and making sure that we take lessons learned from the last time to make it better, regardless of how well it goes. So just holding that piece in our mind, generally speaking, we're hearing very positive feedback from this. Not all of the kits were distributed. There were 2 days to pick them up at, the number has left my head, but I think it was 53 AOT facility sites and 4 school sites. This program was created basically in a week. It was communicated. There was a short timeline for communication, and from my perspective, speaking as the lead communicator for the Agency of Education, the fact that approximately and almost nearly half of the student population of the state, that includes our approximately 8,000 independent school students, the fact that almost half of them got a kit, I think is an extremely large success story. And speaks to the fact that, if half the students were coming in to school having had a test, obviously we would like that number to be 100%, but we haven't seen those numbers for our school-based response programs in terms of parental consent. So I think it was really good to see that. We have kits left over. Actually, I should put that in the past tense. We had kits left over. The kits are being delivered today and tomorrow by the Agency of Transportation to schools basically in the region. So we have variable burn rates. Burn rate's not 100% accurate. We have variable usage rates or pickup rates across the state in terms of how many kits were utilized on a county by county or region by region basis. And so what we have done is divided those kits back up by the schools in the area, and the Agency of Transportation is delivering them out. And my understanding, at least from just seeing some traffic from superintendents, is that the majority of them appear to have received them. But that's sort of hot off the presses news.
Okay.
Just a quick note for go ahead, sorry.
I was just clarifying, the rest of them did get distributed then. That's good.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And just for the committee's awareness, the specific usage recommendations for this are fairly broad, but to maintain in-person learning operations. So schools have flexibility to use them. This is in comparison to, say, for example, test to stay, where there's a very specific uses directed request where you have to be a close contact, an unvaccinated close contact of a case in schools. We have a protocol for how that's administered. It's administered by school nurses. These are over-the-counter kits that can be handed out to a parent or to an educator or a staff member as needed by the school based on their judgment to maintain school operations.
Okay. And just another question is, can schools go remote if they wanted to for whatever issues that they might have in their school, if they wanted to go remote for 3 days, or does that need either Department of Health and or AOE approval, or do they have that ability to do that today?
Sorry, just to make sure I understand, you mean they would essentially cancel school or pivot to remote learning? Okay. Yes. So interestingly, and I was sort of I was interested to learn this. We have an existing process for this in state law and regulation, which is the same as we would use for school closures due to inclement weather or other. I used the term building casualty once and had a lot of people say, "What do you mean casualty?" But so any sort of issue with the physical plant. A couple of years ago, when I was brand new at AOE, there was an issue where a school had a pipe burst that I think knocked an entire wing of the school out of commission for a significant number of days. The method for this is the school closes, and then they have to make up the instructional days requirement in statute, which is, if memory serves, is 175. So what is happening now is that the State Board of Education has, which is the usual receiver of these requests, has delegated again authority to the Secretary of Education to waive COVID-19 related school closures. And I'm at that point, I'm just going to stop at this point because I'm sure he'd be happy to speak with you in more detail about sort of what his thinking is there, what he expects to do. This process heats up in February of each year. And the waivers are sort of roll through the spring in terms of consideration. So I know that he is in the process of figuring out and planning what the process will look like this year and has made some preliminary communications to school. So I just want to defer to him on giving you an update related to that.
Yeah, he did mention it when he spoke to the committee.
I missed the answer. I'm sorry. So yes, indeed, if a student does want to go remote, it's possible or not. I apologize.
Right.
If it's a student, it's a little bit more complicated.
If it's a what?
In terms of, if it's a student, it's a different
Yeah.
question, right? So if a student is out because they're quarantining or if there are other issues, then it's an attendance thing that the school can work through.
Sure.
Related to illness. If it is what we would refer to as a reactive school closure, as in and that could be a number of reasons. It could be high case counts. We're seeing some of those happen. It could also be staffing challenges. It could be snow.
Sure.
It's very similar process. Unlike last year where we had sort of a remote hybrid model under the guidance, we don't have that now. They're operating in person or they can close and they waive the instructional days requirement.
So is there guidance if Hardwick Elementary gets to a certain number of students being ill? Is there something where all of a sudden, the principal and the superintendent can then roll out a remote process? Or are there any guidance? Is there a guidance document around this kind of thing?
I do not want to get over my skis here because the way this worked last year was that when the health department was working with the individual school district on case investigations, through the epidemiology process, they would advise individual superintendents or principals on things like school closures, responsive school closures from a public health perspective. My understanding and my memory from last year, so this is again going off working memory, is that the vast majority of those closures occurred due to staffing challenges or other issues, not because the health department recommended you should close for public health reasons. Those were rare if memory serves. I'm not certain, I would have to check, maybe Shayla has some awareness or we can prepare to come back to what extent those are happening at this point in terms of. So the real question there is whether or not it's a public health recommendation to the school close versus other challenges. Those other challenges are still real and acute, right? Potentially. But whether or not it's a recommendation you should close to safeguard the school. I'm not an epidemiologist, although I've had a chance to learn from some of the states, some of our state epidemiologists working through this pandemic. But my understanding is that in a lot of cases, when it gets that bad in the school, there's already widespread community transmission. So closure of school is not necessarily the first tool in the toolkit in terms of trying to contain spread.
Ted, do schools report numbers of illnesses daily to the Agency of Education?
Schools do not report illnesses to the Agency of Education. The health department's EPI team tracks what they refer to as case investigations.
Okay.
I don't know the number of cases associated. We don't receive information about the number of cases associated with that. That might be something for Secretary French and Dr. Levine to follow up on in terms of what that process looks like. I apologize, I don't have more information there.
Shayla, did you want to add anything or say anything related to any of the questions at this point before?
No, I do want to say that I think that we do have a very specific process for reporting of cases, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head, and we can get that for you.
That'd be great. Okay, thanks. Senator Lyons.
Thank you. And it's great to see both of you. Thank you for being here. And so obviously the communication system, as you pointed out, goes in two directions, from AOE and DOH, but also back from schools. And currently with the tests that are going on, there are a lot of positive cases showing up. And have you established a system for identifying numbers of cases? And it goes along with what we're trying to understand that we were just talking about, so that if you know you reach a critical mass or the transmission rate is gone up a certain level, that at some point you're going to say it's time to be remote. And certainly whether folks are vaccinated or not, we're seeing this transmission continue. So what's the discussion right now around that? So that there has to be some thinking about how to stop this little virus in its tracks from going from one classroom to the next.
Again, sorry, if Shayla wants to weigh in first, I will defer. But again,
Don't worry, I'll ask
Senator,
her.
some of those items are a little bit of a black box to me, because again, the case investigation side is on the health department. But I sort of just in reference to what I was sort of generally saying earlier, when we tend to see high numbers of cases in schools, I mean, and again, we have tests to stay active in the majority of our Vermont school districts and many of our independent schools. So there's an opportunity to, even if there are high case counts, try to preserve in-person learning for their peers who may be close contacts. And so we tend to see logistical challenges crop up as a result of that, either related to contact tracing. So they have a high number of cases, they need time to contact trace. We've seen a couple of schools go remote as a result of that, not necessarily because there's concern about transmission in schools. We've had some emergency requests for resources, for lack of a better word, where the school needs additional test kits, or they need to get a program stood up, or they need resources. And that's something that it's a joint team effort between the Agency of Education, the health department, and our other partners in the testing effort to sort of surge resources to that area. We've done that successfully in multiple cases at this point in places as wide variety as Canaan and in Chittenden County. So I tend to see those challenges crop up. I guess what I'm saying is we see those challenges crop up before we get to that sort of epidemiological threshold, which is that there are other things that seem to happen first. But I'm not an expert on it by any means, so it would be worth having Dr. Levine speak to that.
Yeah, and I definitely can't speak to it. I did just I dropped a link in the chat just for committees. This is an example, like don't take this as the sum total of the policy, but this shows how schools would communicate a positive case to the department. And the department then, works with the school. I don't know of a specific level or specific moment at which the department would suggest or recommend remote learning. I don't know if we have that, but I will follow up with Dr. Levine and get that to you if there is one.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. And I think, having the knowledge out there with parents that if things get really tough in schools and highly infected, that there is a time when the kids will be remote, even though that's a terrible thing to think about at this point. But in some ways it might be exactly what's needed to stop this thing in its tracks. But thank you for that. And then can I ask another question?
Of course.
So school nurses have always been a very an important interest of mine. And I think you know that from my questions in health and welfare. But schools don't have school nurses, and some nurses are doing double duty. So, when I heard the announcement that some of this contact tracing at one point was going through school nurses and testing was going through school nurses, it did put a heavy load on them. And I'm sure they're still feeling highly responsible. Is the Department of Health making any inroads in getting additional personnel who have some training to help our school nurses. Who pays for them? Is the pay comes from Department of Health, or is that going through Department of Health and then to AOE, or is it all through local school budgets? I'm looking at both.
I'm going to punt funding to Ted. Ted, do you know the funding answer?
Okay. But can we go
Um,
back to the first one first? The more important one for me are the people in the school, the nurses in the school.
Are you asking, is there a support like in the health department where they bring them together and support them from like an education
Yeah, no,
standpoint?
I know
or-
that you do a lot of work with them. I'm just thinking about getting more and maybe getting some folks trained up who are not RNs, but have some training, who can help out in this time when they could become COVID coordinators,
Like
even though they may.
EMTs, Jenny, or
Yeah, well, could be an ANA or
So
LNA.
LNAs.
yeah,
So
LNA.
Senator, I think
What
that
did I
goes
say?
back. No, you
Doesn't
said it
matter.
right. That goes back to the chair's kind of first question about, what is the percentage that is of the COVID coordinators, what percentage are school nurses? And then for those that aren't, who are those folks and what sort of training and support do they have? And I don't know that we have data on people other than those two with the Department of Health. We really track just the school nurses and we are in communication with the COVID coordinators. So I can find that out. In terms of resources that schools have in order to hire, I think Ted kind of addressed that, which is, that there is a guidance document that will get you around what schools can do with some of their federal funding. But I don't want to missay what or misspeak and tell you what that is or what they are able to do there. But
Okay.
no, yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Ted.
Sorry, I apologize. I just want to say, I think Shayla got it exactly right. I'll just add that when we talk about workload here, so number one, there's a problem in that all schools have school nurses, right? And that's because school nurses are both educators and clinicians, and they have important clinical roles, right, in the context of a school as clinicians, as RNs, right? Some of the workload that has been added as a result of COVID-19 is not necessarily work that a clinician needs to do, and that is the consensus of our medical advisory team, some of our pediatric advisors at the University of Vermont, as well as some of our epidemiology folks, as well as our folks at the Department of Health. And so there are some avenues to get additional staffing resources or additional support resources to school districts to help alleviate some of that burden. It doesn't necessarily alleviate the burdens of the clinical side of things. And it's not every school district is taking the same approach, right? So some school districts went out to hire for a COVID-19 coordinator and weren't necessarily successful. Things like that, I'll just use
Yeah, I'm
specific
sorry to
example.
interrupt, but who wants to be a COVID-19 coordinator? It's a difficult
Absolutely.
title.
We as the state, just to give you a granular example, Test to Stay, the consensus was when we were planning the program, you don't need any clinical experience to do it. It can be organized. Some districts, Maple Run, for example, up in the St. Albans area, I believe it's the central office, the superintendent, their executive assistant, and a couple of other folks who are managing sort of a drive-through process, right? There is some flexibility in how folks structure these programs. And that's because the superintendent decided, I can't stress my nursing staff more. I need to figure out other ways to do this program. We as the state have worked to try to source additional staff resources. We have had mixed success with that, again, because of the hiring environment. Those individuals, the state staffs as sort of a temp service contract, I believe they're funded through, I believe, one of our federal grants, which is a health department grant that we're using for school testing. I can confirm that for you. I'm pretty certain that that's where it's coming from. But other schools have straight up hired someone, and not necessarily a school nurse to help, or someone with a nursing background to help them. They just need additional resources. Others have not succeeded in that necessarily. So it does vary, but there's a lot of this work. An additional burden is it doesn't necessarily need a nursing degree. The challenges of having clinical staff in every school is of course still an important one.
Okay, and I don't want to continue too far along, but just it would be great to get back to us with what happens with the positive tests and how are they reported and how do they influence decisions between Department of Health and AOE and individual schools. And then my last comment is I know that there are people who work in schools who are they could be part of Department of Labor, DCF, or just folks from the community. And I've heard recently that some of these folks are being advised not to go into schools because of the high case rates. But maybe there's some information we can get about how we help people understand whether or not they should be there. I don't know whether the decision has been made based on data or what fear. We don't want decisions made on fear necessarily.
Ms. Livingston, you unmuted. Did you want to?
No, I just agree with you that we do not want decisions to be made based on fear.
Senator Chinden.
So I would just want to bring it back to the question Senator Pershlik asked, because I think in your response that I heard, some nuance was lost. And I think that nuance is really important and a question that I'm looking for more information on. I believe Senator Pershlik asked something to the regard as, do the schools, are they empowered to go remote? And I think you responded quickly, yes, with some additional clarifications. But my understanding from the Secretary's presentation is they are empowered to go remote, but that those remote days are not empowered to qualify them towards the 175. So what I think would be very useful to me, as well as the school districts, and just in where we can spend some of our limited time right now, is what criteria, as we look at the February months where this pandemic and these numbers, and I have 3 kids, I've already gotten close contacts 3 so far this week, and my wife's school is having staffing issues. So I expect there to be a lot of questions about this remote thing. I'd like to know what the Secretary, what criteria is he going to look for to most likely approve these things? Some general parameters for these superintendents, so that when they need to pivot on a dime and go remote, is he going to look at what the remote dates need to entail? Like, if you go remote, what does that mean contact hours or expectations work-wise? What staffing shortfalls will the superintendent need to be able to evidence that there was, and as well as total case count? So some thinking from the Secretary as to what will justify him to approve the exemption for those days to count towards the 175, I think the superintendents would look for, and I'd also be interested in seeing.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. And I was actually going to say something general, and you just got to another level of specificity. So I will just say that Secretary French was foreshadowing a little bit of his thinking with Superintendent Searle, but I'll ask him to come in and give you sort of his thoughts about what the criteria will be and how those requests will be structured. Generally speaking, a lot of our school closures have been reactive. I've used this term a few times, but it means either if there are cases, the rare cases that Senator Hooker and Senator Lyons, I think you were asking about earlier, which is for a pandemic epidemiological reason. But more often, I do not have staff to keep the building open. I have so many cases that I can't contact trace and sort out the close contacts from the non in time, and I need some time to pause, reset, and let my staff work. And so those are the types of things I think that will be sort of in the will be waived request, but I'd like Secretary French to be able to give you his thoughts on that.
Yeah, in addition, as you're coming up with a list, we're hoping to have the 2 secretaries in tomorrow afternoon. But back to something I believe Senator Pershlik also asked, which was the kits for kids and the distribution. I suspect there might be another time, if things continue to go as they're going, where kits for kids or the equivalent would be used. And I'm wondering if there are some lessons learned around the AOT use of distribution rather than directly to schools, rather than directly to homeless shelters. I know we heard last year some students and families had just disappeared, and I'm having AOT as spots. I don't know. It would just be interesting. I'm not looking for to be okay. I'm terrible at these sports analogies. Monday morning quarterback. Let's leave it there. I'm not looking to be that person. I'm just thinking what might be more successful, or maybe this wasn't kicked out of the park, kicked through the goal, and this was the way to do it. So just something to talk about a little bit with him.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. What I'll say is you said something that I think you're familiar with. Dr. Briggs Campbell, our Federal Education Funds Manager and one of my team members and involved in our testing program, sort of what she said is, this is not the last distribution. We will have more coming, and we are continually able to surge resources, as I mentioned earlier, to schools, as well as we do ongoing distributions to support their ongoing testing programs. Certainly we will, we can share sort of the thoughts and feedback from this time. I will note something that's just fairly unique about this, which is that this occurred during a time of the winter break, when we were hoping as much as possible from the state's perspective to alleviate schools of any burden of needing to work, understanding that they did really Herculean efforts in the fall and wanting to give folks time with their families and to reset and prepare for so that was part of the decision making. We have a pretty well developed at this point way of distributing resources through schools. And so those sort of considerations would certainly be on the table going forward.
I'm just thinking, even if any
time.
citizen in Bennington, if you said, pick up a kit, we're going to open up the high school. I bet whether you have children in school or not, everybody would know where the high school is. If you said, pick it up at the AOT, garage, I bet you're talking very few people are going to have any idea where that is. And I'm just thinking going forward, is there a way to deliver some of these? Did kids with parents with disabilities get these? Did kids in homeless shelters get these? Kids that are, ghosted, that's basically, something that we can talk to the secretary about. Senator Hooker.
Thank you. I just want to go back to the triggers for a minute and just comment that it isn't just the number of cases. I heard a superintendent talk about 22 staff members who were out one day. I mean, the school had to close. They just couldn't work. And so, what kind of accommodations then are going to be made for that? Looking at the remote learning scenario, and if we have to close schools for a couple of weeks, are we going to be able to pivot so that we can do that with some kind of efficacy?
Absolutely, Senator. I'm a little bit more comfortable with that line of questioning than the epidemiological areas, just because it's closer to my area of expertise. But staffing, the ability to keep a building open safely, there's a definition of how superintendents can safely, or a principal can safely operate a building, what the minimum staff requirements are. And that's an educational question, not a public health question necessarily. It's related to the school operations side of things. So that's we see more of at least that's my belief, is that we see at this point, more of those sort of reactive school closures based on staffing considerations and patterns like that.
If whenever you would say a word or two about vaccine mandates for staff, are there mandates for staff, and for those that may not, perhaps it's a health reason that they may not be vaccinated, would those individuals be tested before coming into the school? I hear a lot of things. I know people who have at-home care workers for an elderly parent. There aren't these certain requirements. The disease seems to be getting transferred in ways that really are preventable from my perspective. So I'm just wondering where things stand with mandated vaccines for teachers and school personnel.
Senator, with your leave, I'm going to defer this question to Secretary French, simply because a lot is moving and shifting on this right now. There is, folks may be familiar with the OSHA rule on the federal level that is engaged in court action on the federal court system. And so it's I don't want to make any promises given the what's going on in that area, but the secretary may be able to speak more accurately to next week. We're just sort of in the moment where things are unsettled there.
Yeah, and I'd be curious also. I think some of us generally accept that medical personnel are vaccinated, and yet I remember there was a story a couple of, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago out of Albany Med. They said this is a hospital in Albany, New York, which isn't too far from Bennington, saying to physicians, you have to be vaccinated. And I think 11 to 15 walked. They said, no, thanks. It is time for me to either take my retirement or I'm not going to get vaccinated and I'm going to leave my job. So I'd be curious, nursing staff as well should fall into that category.
I do feel confident in saying that Vermont schools across the board, regardless of staff category, are very highly vaccinated. We have data to substantiate somewhere well north of 85%, and that's based on the state's vaccination data. And that sounds like we believe that's a very low number. And the reason why is, if you remember back in the spring, I believe Secretary French gave you an update on our vaccination campaign. At that point, we provided an access code to educators to allow them to sign up early. Many of them took advantage of that. We were also able to get some data from some of our pharmacy partners on vaccination, but not from all pharmacy partners, and not necessarily all educators used that code. Some are volunteer firefighters who maybe got first responder vaccination or fell into one of the older age bands or something like that. So we don't have perfect data on vaccination rates. What I will say is almost across the board, if you ask superintendents, they tend to say something along the lines of, I can count on one hand or I can count on two hands the number of folks in my district who are unvaccinated. So the number of folks, we feel very comfortable that the vaccination rate for staff is very high.
My final comment will be, I think on Tuesday, we had superintendents with us, with the secretary and others, and there did seem to be, if you go back and watch, some kind of disconnect between Department of Health and Agency of Education and the superintendents. I mean, there were superintendents that were learning things that they felt they should have known a week before or so from this, public hearing, from this time. So I would it would be more, we're trying to be helpful. I mean, we're gathering knowledge. We're trying to be helpful to our constituents and to all of you and to the citizens of Vermont. And I would just say, as much as you can continue to work together to make sure you're all communicating as effectively as possible, that would be greatly appreciated. And if there's anything you need from us, please don't hesitate to ask. I sometimes think asking in general in society in some ways makes you feel as though it's not success. We feel like we are in this with you. We want to be in this with you, so please just let us know.
Senator, I really appreciate that. I'm sorry, I maybe missed the comment. I did listen to the YouTube of the live stream, and
Sure.
so I'm not certain of what that particular instance could be. Just generally speaking, however, I will say, because the level of effort on the state side is also very high to try to make sure that we're being responsive. So it was. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying that. I think that we have some frustration. The timing of some of the guidance from the CDC has been, I'll maybe just say, less than ideal. We get directives from the CDC that the state then has to analyze, respond to.
Sure.
We have to update guidance and things like that. So
Yeah.
I know in a lot of cases we're getting frustration from superintendents who are saying something along the lines of, I heard from the CDC, or I have my school nurse trying to interpret the CDC guidance. And then our response has been, well, we're trying to interpret the CDC guidance. Wait for us, or when I say us, I mean, wait for the health department to issue guidance.
Yeah.
But that happened over the winter break for a lot of folks, which I think was probably emotionally taxing. I know it was for me personally to sort of log in after Christmas and see some of this stuff coming through. And so certainly we're just in a very volatile moment right now.
Yeah, I
And
appreciate
there's
that.
still
Yeah.
some unknowns. And that maybe that's a product of it. What I will say is, I'll just say superintendents are not shy about reaching out when they need something, or when they have a question, or when they have a suggestion. It's been wonderful. I did my my undergraduate thesis in organizational learning, and I only remembered that like a month or two ago. I've been doing this pandemic for a year and a half. But I have to say, like and so I went back and looked, and they check almost all the boxes, and I think we check most of the boxes as well in terms of creating a good organizational learning dynamic to receive feedback and respond to it. Sometimes our response time is measured in hours, which is really good for a government agency where you have to check in with various folks and make sure, and we have to check with the epidemiological experts and make sure we're not getting over our skis. But they're not shy. They reach out to Secretary French directly, and he is able to then inform our team or inform the health department folks, or they'll reach out to us. So that said, I mean, I'm a communications professional. First off, I started in the legislative branch as a communicator. So I will always welcome feedback on how we can communicate better from anyone. It's good user feedback. And we always look to improve those processes. And as a matter of fact, I'll say most of our processes right now, at least for our communications with our educator target audiences, are informed by superintendent feedback. We listen very carefully to what they say that they want from us for the timing and tempo of communications. I appreciate your time.
Any other questions, senators? Any final comments? I'm sorry, Senator Persick, did you have a question?
I did have another constituent ask me a question, and hopefully it's a quick answer. Is they had a child that had gotten a positive test, but they were pretty sure it was an error, and they called the Department of Health to see if there was a way. They had then gotten 2 tests that were negative, but their school was saying there's no way to nullify a positive test. And they just thought, with all the tests and everything going on, that there should be a way, since their child has missed so many school days, they didn't want them to miss more when they were confident that there was some kind of mix-up with the test. Because I won't give you the whole story, but they were pretty convinced, and they said the Department of Health agreed with them, but AOE or the school just said, sorry, once you have a positive test, there's no way, no matter, even if you took 100 tests and they were all negative, you still have to do the quarantine. Do you have any?
It's probably worth the school talking to the health department about it. Again, this is maybe a much better question for the epidemiology team. Excuse me, but you have Ted, armchair epidemiologist here. My understanding from the health department is that their definition, it depends on the test, right? Senator Perch, like right up front, it depends on the test. I'm sort of assuming an antigen test, like a rapid antigen test. A rapid antigen test to the health department counts that as a positive case. There have been questions about the accuracy of those tests. The positivity of the case is usually accurate. And so they consider the case no matter whether you then subsequently test negative. It has to do a lot about whether, the things that I'm not capable to speak to, but in terms of when the test is taken and all of those things. So that's a worthwhile question. If they're concerned there is truly an error and want to check in, the school has ways to talk to folks in the health department, their school nurse liaison or others, to sort of really check in to see what's going on with the test. And I know more about this for PCR tests rather than antigen tests, but we do occasionally, when we would do PCR tests and send to the lab, occasionally you would get results that were much rarer than positive or negatives, but you get results that were tagged as inconclusive, and that's the test just didn't work properly. And in that case, there's no option but to retest the student or retest the person. If you get an inconclusive result, it doesn't mean one thing or the other. I'm not sure if something similar exists for antigen.
This wasn't an antigen. They got it sent in, so they thought it was mixed up with another family member. They basically were convinced it was a lab error. But basically, it seems like once you get a positive test, there's no way. You just have to do the quarantine. There's no way to change that.
I defer to Shayla on this, but perhaps if it's particularly the PCR test, it may be worth to call the call center at the health department and ask them to look into it with the lab.
Okay. Yeah, that's what
Livingston?
Yeah, Senator, it sounds like they did contact the health department, which would be the right first step. And then there are teams that talk to the school nurse and the child's pediatrician. And, I can't speak to this specific case because I would need a lot more information, but you would use a bunch of different information from this case and from this child to then determine that as a team. So it is a team-based approach, and it is possible that that school holds a policy that is stricter or more specific. I don't know. And so I don't want to, and that's up to that school too, and that school nurse and that team as a whole. So they do use a team-based approach. So even if maybe the health department said, and again, I can't speak for them. I don't know what the case was, but maybe it was okay. That whole team has to agree and work together. And that is, I think, very important and has worked very well, is to have it be a team-based approach and have the department and the school nurse and the pediatricians working in tandem. That's an important element of making sure that, that we're doing a good job for our kids across the state.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you both very much. Really appreciate it. And if you wouldn't mind sharing the outstanding questions with your directors, secretaries, and Daphne will be in touch with them later today to hopefully, while this is still fresh, hopefully see them tomorrow afternoon. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Committee, I took your recommendations and priorities, have been working through them with Ledge Council a little bit and with Daphne, and starting to schedule stuff for next week. Still waiting to hear from the corner office on the division of labor as it relates to the waiting study. And appreciate everybody's time today looking at that. And if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, or at least review it in a little bit more detail, I would encourage you to do so. It really is a good report. Anything else at this point? Senator Persick.
Sorry, I just missed what you were looking, just kind of for air traffic control from the corner office, like who's going to do what, or we're going to break it up into pieces, things like that.
Yeah. So Senator Hardy, I asked Senator Hardy and Representative Kornheiser were kind enough to offer to divide it up where they thought, committees, well, for a range of different reasons where things might start, particularly around who would have jurisdiction. And so they have put together a proposal, and they have shared it with the corner office. I'm happy to share it with all of you. It's nothing private. It's just Senator Balint and Speaker Kwinski would like it to move and recognize that different parts could end up with different committees, and that and also there would be some overlap, but they put something together. Why don't I will forward what they have put forward to all of you, so you have a chance to weigh in on it as well. I'll do that as soon as we adjourn for the day. Yeah, Senator Lyons.
Yeah, I was just thinking it might be helpful after we've looked at that to have a discussion. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from Senator Hooker and Senator Perschlick, because they were engaged in this process and there was no preference given to one decision or another, whether it's categorical aid or whether it's keeping weights in place. So I'm interested in their thoughts, and I have some questions as a result of today and as a result of going through the study. Haven't been through it thoroughly, but I've read the whole thing, and so I have a lot of questions about data utilization and some other areas. So it would be great if we could have a conversation.
Great. I appreciate that. I will schedule time then for a conversation first thing next week, and bring some folks in to help us navigate that. In the meantime, I will send this to Daphne, and I'll ask her to send the recommendations put forward by the two chairs as to air traffic control. And listen, I'm open to whatever committee members would like to do. If people see something that they disagree with, I think we'll then have a conversation with others and see if it can be reworked. Yeah.
I just want to point out that I consider, and I think Cheryl or Senator Hooker agrees, that Senator Chittenden is an honorary member of the task force committee.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. People probably know that he did apply to be on it. I had
Sort
to
of.
sort through all of the hundreds of applications, and he was close to the top.
I did
He
follow
should
it
just
very
count
closely.
himself lucky.
I did follow it closely as it went along, and I've read the report over and over, and I think you all did a great job. I look forward to these discussions. I think it's going to be a helpful and useful discussion.
Indeed.
No, it's so yeah, I completely agree with Senator Lyons that we'll look to, particularly to Senators Hooker and Perchlik, when they see how this division of labor was outlined, let us know what you think. So, yeah. Okay. And so grateful that I feel like we have so many people from health and welfare on this, particularly as we look at vaccines and all of this stuff related to COVID. So it is incredibly helpful. So thanks. Okay, everyone, have a great evening. Look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow.
Thanks.